Oh, okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Yeriban Saeed, the Barzani scholar and the director of the Global Kurdish Initiative for Peace. It's really a great pleasure to have you here for this very timely and insightful discussion on the geopolitics of natural gas in the Middle East. And of course, we have chosen the easiest part of that, which is the Kurdistan region and Iraq. So the title of our panel is Leverage or Liability, Kurdistan's Gas on the Iraqi and the Regional Chessboard. Our focus, of course, is on one of the critical and complex part of this story, which is the strategic trajectory of the gas sectors in both the Kurdistan region and also Iraq. Iraq is home for an estimated 127 trillion cubic meters of gas, with the Kurdistan region counting for about 20%. So this concentration highlights the strategic importance of the Kurdistan region in the term of natural resources to Iraq's energy security, as well as to become a potential gas exporter for the regional market. So natural gas is no longer a commodity. It has become one of the most contested arenas in the regional and global power dynamics. And the Kurdistan region's emerging gas sector, in particular, stands at a crossroad. It could be Erbil's next source of leverage, or it could really be a very costly liability, as we have seen in the past, especially with oil. And also Kurdistan and Iraq together see that at the intersection of a rivalry of a revenue infrastructure, export routes with implication far beyond the borders of the Kurdistan region as well as Iraq. Therefore, the development of these resources had the potential to fundamentally reshape not just the domestic politics, but also the regional power dynamics. So this panel will explore the domestic tensions between Erbil and Baghdad, as well as the quieter but not less consequential competition among regional and global players. We'll look at Iran's efforts to preserve its strategic gas investment that it has made in the last almost 20 years in Iraq. We will look at what the United States and the Western countries can do to help Iraq and the Kurdistan region to get energy security. So To discuss all of this, we are fortunate to have three top experts to help us unpack these very complex and interconnected issues. So I'm going to just very briefly introduce our guests. Mashallah, they have a very long profile. They have worked extensively in the Middle East. So on my, is it left? Yes, left. I've got Victoria Tyler. She's the director of the Iraq Initiative at the Atlantic Council, a national security leader with over 2 decades of experience in the Middle East and Europe. Prior to joining the Atlantic Council, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the State Department. And in the middle, we have Nawam Raidan, who is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She writes on topics related to energy, maritime risk in the Middle East. She is a co-author of the Institute's map on maritime attack in the Middle East since 2019. And prior to joining the Institute in June of 2023, Raidan was an independent energy researcher and consultant working and living in Baghdad and Beirut. And on the far left, we have got Dr. Ra'ad Al-Qadiri, who is a senior associate in the Energy Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's an international country risk specialist with over 20 years of experience advising senior gas and oil executives, as well as government leaders on management of long-term investment strategies, above ground risk mitigation, stakeholder engagement in the energy sector. Previously, he was a managing director for energy, climate, and sustainability at the Eurasia Group. So we will begin with insights from our panelists. I'll start with a question. We'll try to make it, as conversational as possible. And when we are done with our conversation, we are going to open up the floor for questions. And also, we don't have coffee because we have got better things for you, which is kebab. We have ordered Erbil kebab from the Erbil restaurant here in Fairfax. So that was the whole rationale behind not giving you coffee, in addition to make sure that you'll sleep well. So let's get started. And of course, I will be sitting right there. And also, there's one thing that I want to admit. I thought that I was the only one who speaks more languages than anyone else in Washington, D.C., until I read Victoria's profile. She speaks 5 languages. Then I said, I'm really not happy, Victoria. So let's start with the internal dynamics and ask a question that starts with the title of our panel, which is, the KRG's gas sector could be a sort of leverage or liability. What do you think is the most significant factor in the term of whether it is geopolitical, economic, security, or legal standpoint that could prevent the Kurdistan region from developing its gas sector, and what it should do to overcome it? Brad, you want to take on that one?
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you all for spending your time with us for the next hour and a half. I hope we can keep you awake without the coffee. I'm sure we'll do our best. What is the answer to the question, leverage or liability? Okay. I think if you look at Iraq, including the Kurdistan region, and I've been working this for over 3 decades, it's always talked about in terms of potential, and that potential is never realized. And you go back to the questions of why that potential was never realized. And I think you have multiple issues that are there. Weakness of institutions, weakness of human capacity, infrastructure challenges, you know, but when you get back to it and you look at, I think, you know, the key elements that have stood in the way of the effective development, particularly in the Kurdistan region of oil and gas, it comes back to politics and the link between that politics and commercial elements and the economics of contracts and the economics of deals, in the sense that, you know, there has been a misalignment in Kurdistan from the beginning with international oil and gas companies as to what the priority is. International oil and gas companies invest to make money. Kurdistan regional government has sought investments to strengthen its claim to greater autonomy and ultimately to create the foundations for an independent Kurdish state if the opportunity arises. And there has been a mismatch in terms of expectation and in terms of risk and in terms of perceptions of what the priorities are. There has been a similar mismatch between Erbil and Baghdad since 2003. And you know, I worked there 2003, 2004, and you know, on various bits up to 2008, 2009 for the British government. And you know, you had a fundamental mismatch that is that's in the constitution but never been clarified, and that has guided the politics of Baghdad and Erbil, and that is a different view of decentralization. For the KRG, the view of decentralization has been more akin to confederation. That, you know, fundamentally you have a weak center, and that the powers and ultimate competent authority and sovereignty, except in very few areas, lie with the regions, the provinces. For the government in Baghdad, really certainly since 2006, 2007, as it began to strengthen and as the Shia parties began to unify in power, it's been a view of federation, that actually the central government decides and the central government has ultimate authority and it decentralizes some of that power. So when you take those two things, the Kurdish desire fundamentally to weaken its links with Iraq as much as possible, and an still unsettled set of issues regarding where the balance of power lies, how sovereignty is divided, how it's apportioned, you get to the mess that we're in right now. And that is also creates problems in terms of commercial risk. Quite simply, the interpretation of the constitution by Baghdad and Erbil are different. It's never been clarified in law. You have a variety of legal cases that fundamentally, you know, create as much uncertainty as they create certainty. And so as you move forward, is it leverage or liability? It should be neither. If you look at Iraq's needs as a country and the Kurdistan region as part of that country, ideally what you would say is you have this massive resource base that spreads from north to south. How do you create the political conditions to take full advantage of that for a country that desperately needs the energy, desperately needs the finances, and fundamentally can put itself on the map as a major regional hub that links the Gulf states in the south with Central Asia states in the east and Europe to the west? That's the question. How do you achieve that? The moment you look at Kurdistan gas as a liability or leverage, you've changed the equation. It's automatically, are we stronger or are they? And that ideally isn't going to be the picture. And certainly when you look at companies that want to invest, what they want is certainty in terms of the law, certainty in terms of their investment, the ability to monetize their investment, which means getting resource to market at international price. And the politics of Iraq gets in the way of that right now. So how do you change the picture?
Thank you. Very succinct and also insightful about the internal problems in Iraq. But let's, zoom out a little bit to the regional picture, Iran and Russia. Noam, probably the question for you. How do these two countries view the development of natural gas in the Kurdistan region and also as well as Iraq? What are their strategic, priorities? Can you enlighten us on that?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone. When we say Iran nowadays, everybody, wakes up and everybody wanna hear about Iran in the region. That's a very good question. I'm gonna start with Iran and then Russia because, and this is my personal opinion, Iran is more important here than Russia right now, especially in Iraq. When it comes to Iran, how many of you remember what happened in June when Israel struck gas treatment plants in Iran? You remember what happened, yeah? Back then, at that time, a lot of people thought, what's the implication on global markets, implications on the Persian Gulf, flows from the Persian Gulf? A lot of people got it wrong because as an observer back then, focusing on the region, specifically Iraq, I was concerned about two things. One, the impact on Iran's own domestic needs, and two, Iraq's heavy reliance on Iran. So I'm going to give you just two numbers. I will not bother you a lot with numbers, but I love numbers a lot. So Iraq imports from Iran, I'm talking about data shared by the Prime Minister in 2023, imports 10 billion cubic meters per year. And at the same time, how much does it flare, means associated gas in the south? Around 12 billion BCM, billion cubic meters, meaning they are importing from Iran volumes they themselves can actually produce within the country domestically, but there are a lot of challenges within Iraq. There are challenges when it comes to supply chain. What do I mean by supply chain? I'm talking infrastructure. A lot of people, when they hear natural gas, they think, gas well, and immediately it is sent, to consumers. It doesn't work like that. We do have the production, we have the transmission, the distribution transmission. In Iraq, this supply chain is super weak. It's very fragile. There are certain elements in it, like distribution and transmission. They're extremely weak. The country hasn't been investing in them a lot. And in Iraq, they always focus on production. They focus on generation if it's in the electricity sector, and this is a big problem. They do not invest in transmission and distribution when it comes to the supply chain. So Iraq, and since 2017, at least 2017, they started importing gas from Iran. And those volumes have been super unreliable, meaning Iran itself needs gas. In winter, I lived in Baghdad for several years. And I remember in winter, we had to rely a lot on private generators. Why? Because there's no electricity from the government. And it gets really cold in winter. Well, if you touch the water, it's super cold. So you can imagine how bad it is when Iran reduces gas to Iraq around that period. And also Iran has its own challenges. They need a lot of gas. So to keep it brief, Iraq's imports from Iran are super unreliable, but at the same time, they have a lot of challenges to quit Iranian gas. When it comes to natural gas in Iraq, you need to think of two types. We have the associated gas and we have the non-associated gas. I'll also keep it simple. I will not go into technicalities. When it comes to associated gas, we're talking about gas that is produced with crude oil. And when it comes to Iraq, associated gas is mainly in the south, where the giant oil fields are. Iraq has been trying for a long time to invest in those, in capturing the associated gas that is produced with crude oil, but they've been very slow. And you've all heard about US exemptions for Iraq to continue importing gas from Iran. So they've been very slow when it comes to investing in their own domestic natural gas production. And at the same time, they haven't been able to cut the reliance on Iranian gas. So up until now, they continue importing gas from Iran. Now, when it comes to the politics itself, can we say that Iran is using those gas exports to Iraq as political leverage? It depends. A lot of people might say yes, a lot of people might say actually no. But absolutely, we have to think about it in political terms, because we have Iranian influence in Iraq, and some people might say like these gas exports to Iraq are a way for Iran to keep its influence high in the country. This might be true, correct. As for me, I say that if other countries, let's say like the United States, they want to cut this, not cut this reliance, but help Iraq move away from adversaries, US adversaries like Iran, the US itself also needs to, and this is my personal opinion, try to think how they can also help the Iraqi government to move away from Iran. This will require not just investments, it's understanding of Iraqi politics itself, understanding that Iraq cannot just cut its relations with Iran overnight, understanding Iraqi culture itself. And I'm mentioning this as a person who lived in the country, and I understand how difficult it is to kind of imagine Iraq moving away from Iran overnight. And at the same time, understanding that in Iraq, really a lot of politicians, even the government itself, there are certain things they're not aware of. Mean when it comes to modern technologies, when it comes to how they can make things work, planning, understanding the supply chain itself. That way they can invest in a better way in their own domestic natural gas production. I'm a believer in US Iraqi energy cooperation, and I do believe that it can be successful, but it will require overcoming a lot of challenges, specifically political challenges and security challenges. So this is on Iran. And other thing is that I wanted to mention was earlier this week or this month, we had the Global Gas Conference in Milan, right, in Italy. And there was a US official who was addressing European partners saying, like, we would like something along these lines. We would like the European partners to move away from Russian gas and take more US gas. That way they don't have to rely on adversaries. And the first question that occurred to me, great, how would you do that in Iraq? And I believe you do need some innovative thinking when it, specifically in the US, when it comes to Iraq, looking at it not only from an Iran lens is very important, but at the same time thinking of innovative solution, looking at China, for instance, in Iraq, seeing how China operates on the Iraqi energy scene, and trying to think of innovative ways to kind of improve that cooperation between the US, Washington, and Baghdad. When it comes to Russia, I'm going to keep it brief. In the past several years, right before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there were a lot of talks about Russia's investment, specifically right in the northern region, in Kurdistan, in network of pipelines, and there was a lot of hype. I would call it hype about exporting gas from northern Iraq to Europe. I myself, I very much I won't say underestimate these things, but I don't pay much attention to them. Back to what Raed said earlier, you really have a lot of challenges in Iraq that need to be addressed first before getting to these, I would call them the big talk about exporting gas from Iraq to Europe. This will come later on, and if it comes. But back to what Raed said, there's a lot of challenges, specifically politics, security, that need to be overcome in order to get to the bigger issue. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Noam. You are right in terms of the associated gas and also non-associated gas. Actually, according to some estimates, is almost 90% of the non-associated gas is located in the Kurdistan region. We have Hormuz, we have Kurdamir, and other, great fields. And recently, I think it was in May of this year, that the Prime Minister of the Kurdistan region was here to sign two big deals with two US companies to invest, I think, $110 billion in the course of the next 20 years, something like that. And if they come to material, I think that will help not just the Kurdistan region, but also Iraq, and it has potential to export gas to Turkey and potentially to Europe as well. So with that, let's bring in, the Uncle Sam perspective. And, Victoria, you worked for the US government. You dealt with Iraqi officials, with the Kurdish officials. First, I would like to ask, what is the current US policy towards Iraq when it comes to energy? Is it just focused on making sure that Iraq's reliability on Iran would be reduced, or it is a broader, more strategic in the term of economic development?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for hosting me. So I would say, across both the Biden administrations and the Trump administration, I think just generally, there's broad bipartisan consensus that the U.S. government should be focused on reducing Iraq's reliance on Iranian sources of energy. And certainly, even in the previous administration, there was a focus on supporting U.S. investment. I think I would say that's really turbocharged under the Trump administration. And I think that we see a much greater focus on making big business deals. And so I think that's something that the Iraqi government has really sensed and seized upon. And so I think that we've seen, a head of agreement signed with Chevron. We've seen, obviously, the Kurdistan regional government sign these two deals. I think there's really a recognition that, identifying opportunities for U.S. companies in the oil and gas sector is something that will be seen very positively by the Trump administration. And frankly, I think that's something that is also just to the benefit of the development of the Iraqi oil and gas sector. I think we all want to see the Western companies and Western governments generally want to see, greater development of the oil and gas sector. It's really, I think, quite a shame that, Iraq is so rich in natural resource and it still is importing, and that they still don't have, reliable 24/7 electricity. So I think, bringing in major U.S. investors to help develop the sector, try to support energy independence, I think that's, going to remain a high priority, across all administrations, but certainly from the Trump administration.
Okay, thank you. You're absolutely right. Iraq probably generates about 27 gigawatt of electricity, peak hours, with needs, I think, seasons about 55, according to some estimates. In the Kurdistan region, however, they have done some, a better job in the term of electricity. Now they have this Iraqi program. It provides 24-hour electricity. I got to be honest, I was very skeptical, given the Kurdistan region also does not generate that much. It just generates about 4.5 gigawatt of electricity. But, they have made changes, reforms in the term of, the tariff collection as well, that have helped it. And now people know how to use electricity, and probably, the same model could be applied for the rest of the Iraq as well. Rad, let's go back a little bit more for the internal dynamic, because you laid out all of them very, very well. But what are the solutions? What are the practical solution? Does it require third-party mediation, or do you think there should be a law, even though the hydrocarbon law has been sitting there since 2007? No one wants to touch it. It has been very controversial. There have been some attempts, but so far it has not been legislated, even though, the British government, the European, the US has constantly tried to make this work, because ultimately that is how you're going to solve all these problems between the Kurdistan region and Iraq, for example, or Baghdad.
You have to get some common ground between Kurdistan region and various political forces in Baghdad which are primarily Shia political forces now, over the years, have become the dominant counterparty on what the future of the country looks like. I go back to what I said before, that's never been achieved. Third parties aren't going to help. I have been that third party on several occasions. It just gives you a headache and makes you very depressed. The reality is, and I think part of it comes down to finances. So the reality is this: if the KRG can afford to live on its own resources, if it has that wherewithal, then it potentially has political options moving forwards. Will it get the territorial boundaries that it wants? Probably not. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, can the KRG live under its own revenue resources? So, and you've had periods of time where that has been tested. Fundamentally, since 2013 and onwards, the KRG hasn't been handing over a lot of oil to Baghdad. So it's had the revenue, hasn't been able to sell it at international prices. There have been logistical issues, etc. But it's been selling its oil independently, and that revenue has been coming back independently. And the question has been, can the KRG live on that? The answer would be probably not, if that's where we are. If we look at where we are right now, it still needs disbursements to be able to balance the budget, and it has significant levels of debt, not only to the international oil companies that are there, but to traders and to various infrastructure providers as well. So it comes down to that question of, one, is it practical? And the second thing is, what do the Kurds want? What does the KRG want to be when it grows up? And it's tried to be half pregnant so far. It stays with Iraq by virtue of need, but it constantly looks to a future where it is separate. And that's just on the Kurdish side. In Baghdad, you've had I think an Arab population that has gone from seeing decentralization as being an ambition, certainly in the 2003 to 2007 period, and then going through a variety of security problems that's weakened the central government, and now a situation since 2017 where the central government has become progressively stronger and is expressing a view much more forcefully that actually what it wants is federation, not confederation. What you have to do is overcome that. So, constitutional reform, which has been on the books since 2005, has never been achieved. The US notion with the Constitution was leave a whole bunch of areas ambiguous and we'd get laws afterwards that would be agreed by sensible parties acting maturely moving forward. You haven't had that. So the laws that you mentioned, the revenue sharing law, the oil and gas law, the national oil company law. And where have they all fallen down? They've fallen down over the issue that the KRG has demanded maximum autonomy and maximum independence, and actively trying to undermine Baghdad's fiscal and political power, and Baghdad has resisted that effort. So we're at the same place in some ways as we were in 2003. I think what's changed is the fiscal balance, and what's changed, and obviously Iraq's the South's ability to develop oil resources and therefore have more revenue. And again, I think the South has coalesced more and become, Kurdistan has enjoyed, stability and security for a longer period of time than, the rest of Iraq has. But unless you get back to that question of, where do the two sides want to meet? And you can see it in the negotiations that are going on right now. The negotiations that are going on right now are a microcosm of that. And put aside the complexities of the IOCs having a say in it, but between Baghdad and Erbil, there is a reluctance to hand over oil, because when you hand over oil, you hand over money. When you hand over money, you hand over political power. And it's very well understood. And from Baghdad's perspective, you have well, why are we paying you so that you can operate independently? And so, you know, that political problem lies. So I don't have a solution for it. What I suspect is, though, that it isn't going to be an external event, despite the fact that both Baghdad and Erbil look to external pressure and look to the US, look to Iran, look to the Gulf region, whomever, to try and put pressure on their counterparty. In the absence of that, you know, that isn't going to work. So what you have to come down to, and I think ultimately fiscal reality will be it. And fiscal reality has changed the balance of power since 2023. And, you know, arguably moving forward, that fiscal reality may force, one, Baghdad to have a better understanding of what Erbil's needs are and how to cooperate, and Erbil to have a better understanding of what's practical politically as opposed to what's aspirational.
Thank you, Rad. So there appears to be a very pessimistic outlook regarding any practical solution for this problem. So my question for you, Noam, you know, how much Iran contributed to this pessimism, given it is, you know, strategic investment in Iraq, it exports lots of gas, it makes around, you know, $4 billion a year. And also it uses gas as a very, you know, strategic political tool to get extraction, you know, concession from Baghdad as well. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's a very, it sounds easy, but it's difficult to answer. So how Iran has been contributing to all of this, what Raed shared with us, the pessimism.
Rad shared.
The pessimism. I don't know how many of you know that Lebanon is my home country. And as a Lebanese, I do understand that a lot of countries, be it Iraq or Lebanon in the region, they try to blame outside powers for their own misery, for their own corruption, and for being dysfunctional altogether. I cannot say what's happening in Iraq. We need to blame outside powers for it. Of course, Iraq went through one, US invasion, 2003, and post-invasion, the internal strife. And then you had ISIS. We're talking about 2013. And then when Iraq even tried to catch a breath, 2015, they studied production reached probably 4.5 billion barrels per day, like for the first time since just 2003. And then came the military operation against ISIS. 2017, they announced a military victory against ISIS. Then came 2020 with COVID, and all over again. So the country hasn't been really stable for any time since 2003. Some people always try to say, well, yeah, we went through the invasion, but again, you cannot, okay, the invasion is over, right? So we are far away from 2003. You cannot continue saying, because of the war, we are, you know, still going through what we're going through. And at the same time, you cannot say, like, yeah, Iran is actually meddling in our politics, and this is why we are where we are. Iraqis need to work a lot together in order to put the house in order. You cannot always say that Iran is to be blamed. If you are allowing certain Iraqi groups, for instance, not to think about the country's own sovereignty, its own security, not to think about the interests of the Iraqi people themselves, then of course Iran is going to see groups it can actually take advantage of in order to expand its influence in the country. I know this is what happened in Lebanon. This is what happened in Syria. It's happening in Iraq. But at the same time, we cannot say that what's happening in Iraq right now, the dysfunction in the government, the paralysis, I won't call it paralysis, but the high levels of corruption in the energy sector is to be blamed on the foreign powers. The Iraqis are to be blamed for it. They are to be blamed for not taking, I would say, the issue of combating corruption seriously. I worked on combating corruption in the electricity sector in Iraq. I worked on a big project in 2022, 2023. And the things you hear, it's just even taxi drivers know about it. Everybody knows in Iraq about the level of corruption in the country. And then you ask, like, why nothing is being done? It's very difficult because of the politics, the bureaucracy, and also because you have the wrong people in very important positions, specifically in the energy sector, when electricity and oil and gas. You cannot have people who are politically motivated being tasked with reforming an energy sector. It's as simple as that. Be it in Iraq or like in Lebanon. You cannot have those people in such positions. You need people with the right expertise, people with the right vision in order to reform an energy sector. Now back to the Iran question, how much is it contributing? It is contributing, of course, but again, I don't like to repeat what we hear, in media reports and what we hear other people are repeating that, yeah, Iran is to be blamed for this, or the US is to be blamed for it. The Iraqis themselves are to be blamed for the dysfunction itself. And back again to what Raed said earlier, they have a lot of work to do, be it within the federal government or between Kurdistan and Baghdad. So we need to, I believe, more frank conversation about these things need to be happen or take place. And yeah, I will leave it at that. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think that, certainly it is negative that Iraq is importing so much Iranian energy. It is negative that Iran exerts so much political and economic influence within Iraq. But I do not think that the problems in the energy sector are, attributable to Iran. I think they're attributable to internal domestic Iraqi political considerations. And I think, ultimately kind of bring it back to the question of leverage or liability. I mean, I think one of the challenges, and Rod alluded to this, is that both Baghdad and Erbil view development in the energy sector and energy resources as leverage to be used against the other party. And when you have a political system in which most of the key actors view development of the sector as leverage to be used against other parties, I think it makes it very difficult to achieve the kind of progress I think that we would like to see, certainly from the United States side. And ultimately, I think, it's hard to see how you achieve the full potential of the sector, be it in Kurdistan or in southern Iraq, until you can achieve a more lasting political solution on issues like revenue sharing. Otherwise, I think we've seen what's happened with the Iraq-Turkey pipeline, where you had a deal and it has fallen apart, and it's very difficult, even though all parties should have an incentive to reach a solution where they could all benefit. And I think that such a deal is possible. It's very difficult to construct such a deal because I think particularly the political complexities in Baghdad, the variety of voices that you have in Baghdad mean that even when the prime minister wants to do something, he cannot actually order a particular solution to happen. He must negotiate also within the political system, to work with the variety of political voices and political leaders to try to convince them to support a certain action.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. Just to add to what you said, I sometimes talk to the industry sources, and one of them told me, okay, when we go down to Baghdad to try to solve this, oil exportation, issue from the Kurdistan region through Turkey, we go to the Ministry of Oil, we sit down with them, all these DJs, the General Director will come, they represent different, persons, within PMF, within the, the framework. And, it is such a complicated and multi-layered negotiation that it's almost impossible to reach into an agreement with them, because everyone has to report back, discuss it, and then they come back, to them. So that's why it has been really difficult, as you said, there's a fragmentation of power within Iraq, within the energy sector, within the political system. So it has been quite difficult. So, Rad, do you want to add anything to that?
So just on that point, I mean, yes, all ministries in Iraq represent that, just in the same way that ministries in Kurdistan represent the parties that have their interests there. I mean, the institutionalization is no deeper and no stronger in either place. But I think, just to be fair to Prime Minister Sudani in terms of this, he has managed to put through a deal that was reached in writing in cabinet, where the Kurdish representative ministers in cabinet from both the PUK and the KDP signed off on it. That requires the handover of oil, and the handover of oil will lead to the money will lead to disbursement. So, I think we're beyond, the ministry getting in the way and various other players getting in. Yes, they'll have a view. But I think at this point, you have a cabinet decision. It's been written down. It was really clear. And the handover of oil was a clear part of that. So we're now onto a position of how do you get that handover of oil?
So let me just, press you a little bit on that, because you're talking about the handover of political power if you're going to hand over oil, and that's absolutely true. That's why the Kurds are concerned. So what are the, assurances for the Kurds? For example, if Baghdad is going to disperse revenues, because that's problematic. And also, let me just, be clear about a few things. Yeah, if you just, allow me. It's just not just the oil sector. The Kurdish farmers cannot market their products to Iraq. Poultry owners cannot export their chickens to Baghdad. Iraq is one of the top 10 importers of chicken, but the Kurdish chicken cannot go to Baghdad. I don't know, they speak Kurdish or something like that. Anyhow, so please.
No, but I think, but it goes back to that point that I was saying is so it's not ascribing blame to one side over the other. I mean, the notion that Kurdish chickens can't go to Baghdad, the notion that, you hear talk of exporting Kurdish gas to Iraq makes no sense if it's one country. So it works on both sides. This is the lunacy of it, is decide, are you going to be one country or are you not? So until you have a decision and what shape that's going to take, and that has been at the heart of the political dispute since 2003. That was in dispute when I first went to Baghdad in July 2003. It hasn't eased any. It's taken on different forms. I think what's changed is as the security situation outside of the KRG has gotten more stable. It's not about Iran, it's not about the PMF, what you've had is an Iraqi government that has been able to start to pay attention, the different factions, to other issues, and have begun to use their leverage as a market, as a source of collection of revenue, etc. So, but it goes back, I think the point that the three of us are making, it goes back to, you have two key parties that have to agree, are they in a marriage or are they just friends? And right now they're neither. But fiscal reality does come into that. And so, yes, the point about giving up revenue, what's the guarantee for Baghdad? You could, if you could get beyond can we get the oil going and handing it over? You can set up systems like that. There have been discussions about setting up a separate system to put KRG revenue into, or to have a separate account in Washington. There have been discussions in terms of guarantees of money. You do this deal was only meant to last till December. So you would have had, however, 9, 6, in this case, 4 months of practice, which is where other deals were tried and went awry. So none of this was written in stone, but you have to get to that fundamental point first of saying, it is going to be very, very difficult to convince any politician in Baghdad of a Kurdish line that is what's mine is mine and what's yours is ours. Similarly, it's going to be very, very difficult to convince a Kurdish politician to trust Baghdad to do this in the long term and that they have their best interests at heart. But if that's the fundamental basis of the political discussion you're having, then you're on a hiding to nothing. It's guaranteed to fail. Then you're just looking for leverage from someone from the outside, the US or otherwise, to impose a deal that will create ill feeling and will create problems further down the line.
Thank you. I think a part of it may be strategic communication. We need to reframe some of the words, not export, but selling. As the KRG has been selling electricity to Baghdad, I think currently is selling about 1.5 gigawatt of electricity to Mosul, to Kirkuk, to Diyala province as well. Let me come back to the US. How important the US engagement, or how important the Kurdistan region is for the US strategically, commercially as well, because we saw, like, you know, I never thought the State Department is going to tweet and support the deals that the KRG signed with these two companies. So does that indicate a shift of the US policy towards the Kurdistan region and deals with Kurdistan and Iraq differently?
Know that I would say there's a shift. I think that there is a recognition on the US side that there's opportunities both in southern Iraq and in the Kurdistan region for US companies. And, you know, this administration is going to, you know, actively advocate on behalf of US companies to do business in Iraq and find opportunities to profit. And I think, you know, overall, you know, when you look at the energy picture in Iraq, you know, I've looked at this before as we were trying to figure out, okay, well, what's the plan to help reduce Iraq's reliance on Iranian sources of energy? What is the plan that gets Iraq to energy independence? And there's not one project. It's a million different projects. It's you know, improving and modernizing the electricity grid. It's reducing gas flaring. It's developing gas resources and electricity both in Kurdistan and in southern Iraq. You know, it's efforts like the Runaki project that try to really rationalize energy usage. And so I think it's everything. And so I think that that is also, you know, the context in which we should view US support for energy deals in Kurdistan. We need to support, you know, development throughout Iraq. And if US companies can be at the forefront of helping to develop Iraq's natural energy resources, then, you know, certainly all the better for the United States.
Okay, thank you. And how about, like, you know, risks and opportunities, Rad, for the US companies in both the Kurdistan region and also Iraq? And now we are seeing increasingly, in fact, the US companies also investing in the rest of the country. And also we see the US government also helping, for example, I think it was with the BCG, with the Basra Gas company, I think they gave some finance to develop gas. So how do you characterize the landscape investment for them?
So, yeah, if you are an oil company and you're asking me where to invest and how to invest in Iraq, yeah, I think a very, very simplistic, very general answer would be that the risk in the South is fundamentally tied to US policy. And the risk in the North is payment, as it's always been. In the South, you know, I think what Victoria's outlined is a really sensible and approach to US policy. There are times when one wonders whether that sensible approach will actually be fully absorbed or fully followed. I think there are some voices in Washington who see a government in Iraq as, and particularly if it isn't led by specific individuals, as somehow inimicably tied to Iran, and that therefore a way of putting pressure on Iran is to put pressure on Iraq, and the oil and gas sector is a way of doing that. So I think the risk of sanctions, while they may not be high right now, is still one that when you're talking to investors in southern Iraq is one that they would want to put fairly high on their list. I mean, you know, in the past, there have been payment issues, receivables, that's been solved. Baghdad has been willing to pay in oil, which has been important for the companies in terms of giving them both guarantees, but also opportunities for arbitrage, et cetera, et cetera. But it comes down to what's US policy going to be and what's the region's policy going to be. And that's outside of Baghdad's control. But that to me, if I was asked right now, sort of what would be it? In Kurdistan, it is still going to be an issue of payment. The reality is that the KRG signed contracts that were very attractive to attract companies to essentially break what they saw was a sanction on them being able to independently attract investment. And that came at a cost. And the KRG seemingly cannot afford those contracts. So in the absence of being, and this isn't a new problem. I mean, you've seen the payment issue and the sort of, there's been this balance between can you pay salaries or, what do you need to, what's the bare minimum you need to give the companies, renegotiating of payment terms through the sort of 2015, 16, 17, 18, et cetera. So, but that remuneration risk is still the highest, and linked to that is that risk of getting exports. When I used to advise companies on investing in the KRG, that it was, it's not just access to resource. You have to get that resource to market at international prices and be paid for it. And that, that's a multi-step process where there are risks involved. But, if you think back to when, when a Lebanese bank went bankrupt and suddenly the KRG had run out of money, that is the being paid bit. So, it's a series of things. It's not just about the sanctity of contract. And can the KRG uphold the sanctity of contracts that it has signed without blaming other people for the problem, because they signed them? And I think, and the companies went along with that because the upside looked pretty significant. So I think those would be, so it's a different risk. I think, you wanted something positive. What's remarkable is in terms of this, that security isn't the issue. It was a long, long time advising on Iraq where the first thing you had to deal with was security. First issue you would have to, what you have is relative stability in the country. And I think both governments seeking to take advantage of that. But again, then you still, this is why I said finances ultimately in the long term, and it may come down to the price of oil in the long term, are going to be really fundamental issues in terms of determining that relationship between Baghdad and Erbil.
Thank you, Rad. You spoke on security. Let me ask one question to Noam about security. I've been doing some research about, there's very interesting link about whenever Kurdistan region announced a gas deal or hydrocarbon deal with a firm or with an international oil company, there's always, a day after or a week, within a week, you see attacks on the Kurdistan region's oil fields, gas fields. And we saw that, especially probably the most recent one was in May 25th, you had these big gas deals. And in June until July, you had over 18 strikes over on the Kurdistan's energy sector. So the Kurdistan region really lost about 80% of its oil production capacity. So but the blame, the Kurdistan region, I say, to the PMF group is Iraq has formed multiple committees. They never found out who did it. Do you think any regional powers are responsible to what is happening and they're trying to undermine the development of these very critical sectors?
Don't have an answer about the identity, but we can all
analyze.
Yeah, we can analyze. Yeah, exactly. So I believe, Yerevan, you were referring to Hormor. Hormor is a giant gas field in Kurdistan. It's non-associated gas. And along with Akkas, these are two important gas fields in the country. And Hormor, yes, it was attacked several times since, I believe, 2023, right? And recent this year twice, yeah. There were accusations against Iran-backed groups. I don't know exactly who is behind it, but these are definitely security risks, which me as a company, I would actually also pay attention to. I'm putting money, in the country, and if the gas field, I'm an operator, and the gas field I'm investing in, let's say every 2-3 months, I'm gonna like shut it down, delay the development phase because Hormor is going through a development phase, right, to increase it to around like 700. Then this is also an issue. But I agree to Raed's point, yes, the security in the past, security risks in the South used to make headlines a lot, specifically between I remember 2018, 19, I was working with Clipper Data, a company in New York. We used to cover these, some Iranian-backed groups, right, in the South would launch rockets, specifically when US companies were still in the countries. But in the South, this is less talked about now. And I don't know if you agree with me, right, but more we're hearing about security risks now more in Kurdistan. And Iran-backed groups are being blamed for that. Will that continue? Probably yes, if no one is being held accountable. And if, I would say also the government, the federal government, I don't know how much power it has over those groups, won't be able to bring them under control. So the security risks remain absolutely a big issue. And specifically for me, if as a company, I would definitely think about them, specifically if I'm involved in developing a project, a big project like Hormor, for instance, which is a key project in Kurdistan. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, of course.
So, I mean, I think it's important to remember, when we're talking about all the Iran-backed groups, I mean, certainly Iran provides, logistical support, weapons, and there's times where the groups certainly do act at behest of the Iranians. But there's also a lot of times where these groups are operating independently, and each of the groups has different motivations, different leaders. And I think that we've also seen some of these groups have developed their own independent sources of finance, within an independent political basis. And so I think, as we look at the groups launching attacks, against oil and gas resources, I think, difficult to say, will depend on each group. But, I think one thing that I wanted to highlight was that we know that some of these groups are now also profiting in the oil and gas sector. And so we have seen the U.S. Sanction some of these oil smuggling networks. Some of these networks, have been tied to various militia groups like AAH. And so that the groups themselves have profited through the sale of Iraqi product and also by blending Iraqi product with Iranian product. And so I think, it's important to remember that some of these groups now are becoming more independent, both political and economic actors within Iraq.
Thank you. I think we are nearing our time. Yes.
I realize that this is one of those topics that could go on and on.
Yes.
Two things about those attacks, which I think the ability to identify who did them is easier than the ability to identify why. And I think to Victoria's point, there is a really simplistic notion that somehow, Ali Khamenei sits, or somebody in the Quds force sits in Tehran and has an Xbox game that is Iraq, and plugs it in, and, they play Xbox with Iraq. The situation is more complicated. And the reason I bring this up, for the second set of attacks did more to embarrass the Iraqi prime minister than serve his purpose. I mean, it wasn't ideal to do it on a day when HKN was signing a much sought after deal, given the perceptions of HKN's political prowess. And, so it has sometimes some of those issues, and it doesn't make the security situation any less acute at times and any less threatening or damaging to the companies and to production. But it's very easy at times, I think, and there's a knee-jerk reaction to go, this is Iran trying to break something up, as opposed to, well, we're trying to undermine the prime minister at a time when, you know, he's trying to position himself for a second term and, you know, might be getting too close to Washington in terms of doing this. But it also goes in an interesting link back to, you know, some of the problems of seeking external support and external leverage. Yeah, the reality was that one of the reasons that Baghdad reacted so furiously to those KRG deals wasn't necessarily the deals themselves. It was that it was seen as an active effort by the KRG to come to Washington and solicit Washington backing in the domestic issues of Iraq, and seeking to do it by painting Baghdad as being simply an extension of Iran and the KRG as being the only place where US investment could move in. How those deals were ever valued at $110 billion is beyond me or anyone else who knows anything about the oil and gas sector. I mean, that's some creative accounting that went into that figure. But that's irrelevant. It was the fact that that was put there as the figure. And it was, you need to support us in terms of putting pressure on them. And it goes back to that fundamental point. Baghdad is now trying to do the same thing. Baghdad is now saying, yeah, we're open for business for US companies because we want to balance it. It doesn't solve the problem between the KRG and Baghdad. It simply exacerbates it. So you've played to external forces, and arguably from the point of view of, you know, oil and gas companies operating in the KRG, it's left you more exposed.
Thank you. So we're almost done. I was hoping to finish by 5 and then open, but let me ask, you know, final question. If we reconvene in 5 years from now on, what the Kurdistan region needs to do in order to make sure that oil, probably unlike gas, unlike oil, to become a strategic asset for Iraq's energy security, for regional cooperation, rather than a source of, for example, division and problem? If you tell me just in one sentence, what should be done to promote cooperation?
To promote cooperation, it
Yes.
goes back to that thing. Can you reach a deal that says we're part of the whole? And, you know, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, or some, whatever the phrase is, you know the one I'm going for. But that's, can you reach that? Can you actually reach a deal that says, look, there's going to be an element of trust in here. There's going to be trust and verify. Hell, the Soviets and the US managed to do trust and verify. Yeah. So we could going to have trust and verify that says, you know, there is greater addition. There's more to be benefited in terms of building up this pie as a whole than simply acting antagonistically towards each other. And that will unlock various things, including probably more revenue overall to Iraq. But that's been, you know, you could have made that argument at any point over the last 25 years and it hasn't happened. So something does have to happen. Now, again, if you wanted to be, you know, optimistic rather than the pessimism that I'm renowned for, you know, maybe it's pressure from below. Maybe, I mean, there are some interesting things about Iraq that often get missed. One is that over 75% of the population is under 35 years old. They have no memory of Saddam. They have no memory of the battles that, you know, Erbil and Baghdad are fighting. They have no memory of some of the battles that the political factions that are in power are fighting. So do you get a generation? I mean, does Iraq have, instead of its generation Z, it has its generation Alpha suddenly turning up and going, no, this is ridiculous. There's too much corruption. There's, you know, there are political parties everywhere who are milking the country dry and not delivering what we want. Then you might see some change, and that might force the political parties. I'm not optimistic about that because in 2019, it didn't do that. You've had demonstrations for years in the KRG that haven't done that. But there is that question. But so you go back to that fundamental question. Are you going to get leaders who see long-term value, political value in alliance as opposed to enmity? if that changes in 5 years, the country will be on its way to a certain amount of transformation. If not, we'll be having the same conversation in 5 years.
Thank you. Noam?
With the ongoing political bickering, they ain't gonna go anywhere. No, it won't lead them anywhere. One thing I would like to emphasize is the following. If we look outside Iraq, I'm a person who's very fascinated with the experiences in regional countries when it comes to gas and oil innovation, the innovation in the energy sector. This is lacking in Iraq. Without innovation, you won't be able to develop your energy sector. Without research and development, R&D, you won't develop the energy sector. Without these two, which I very much love to research, because I myself am still an MA student in sustainable energy, don't imagine the energy sector developing in Iraq. I look at Saudi Arabia, for instance. Saudi Arabia, it's fascinating what they did. They've been doing in the gas sector specifically since the 1970s up until now. Iraq, for instance, Iraq has a big problem, which is called flaring, unable to capture the associated gas, specifically in the south. Saudi Arabia was facing the same problem, 1970s. They worked on it. They came up with a master gas system. Up until now, they're still expanding it. It's a beautiful integrated networks of pipelines where they connect the source of gas to the endpoints. The question is, what can you learn from that? Look around you, see how other countries are developing their energy sectors. You have the money, you have the brains, right? You have young people who are studying, who also want to see change. Why don't you leverage those? I get really frustrated. One, as a person who comes from Lebanon, who understands how frustrating it is when sometimes you know that there is a solution, but because of corruption, because of political bickering, nothing is being done. So to keep it short, with political bickering the way it is right now, and as Raed laid it out, they don't want to talk to each other. You don't know what they want, neither what the Kurds among themselves want, or what the federal government and Kurdistan want. They won't be able to come up with a vision for one country. So before these are resolved, let's not talk about big energy projects. I'll keep it at that. So, and I hope they also learn from regional experiences, specifically Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I'd like to emphasize these two.
Thank you. We should recruit you to SIS. You said you're a student. We have the Kurdish program has scholarship and it's very generous. So Victoria, your turn.
Yeah, so I think, from my perspective, I think, the United States will always be a strong supporter of the Iraqi Kurdistan region. But I think there needs to be a more real recognition from the Kurdistan regional government that the U.S. is not going to be able to solve all of these energy problems, and that it's going to require a really active negotiation between the KRG and the political leadership in Baghdad to actually solve these energy issues. I think the U.S. will certainly be interested, will want to be helpful, but I don't think this is a problem that the U.S. can solve. I think it requires the two sides really coming together and finding a way to negotiate a long-term solution to these issues.
Thank you very, very much. And now we open the floor for questions. Please introduce yourself and tell us who you are when you ask the question. And so microphone is coming to you.
Hello. Well, first of all, thank you all for giving such an insightful speech, especially over Kurdistan, which is relatively neglected here in the US, at least. I did have a question regarding any possible case studies from which Kurdish officials or professionals might be looking at to help resolve their issue with Iraq. So for instance, some issues that come to mind to me, I don't know if I might be misperceiving it, would be that of Somaliland and Somalia, Chechnya and Russia, or that of the Nigerian Civil War, which happened decades ago. And again, I was just curious to see if there are any other international case studies from which Kurdish professionals might draw on to help reconcile with the Iraqi government. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. I've done a few, been involved in a few that have come up when Northern Ireland has been sort of presented at times through the British government. You've had, you know, Catalan as a sort of example of, you know, regionalization, decentralization, etc. I don't think they've ever done Russia, Chechnya. At least I've never done Russia, Chechnya in that circumstance. Scottish devolution, but this is, I think there's a certain bias here towards the, you know, this has been through the British government who've tended to sort of do sort of bits that they understand. There were efforts to look at Switzerland at one point, and also efforts to look at Belgium. It's not for a lack of examples. If you have the political will, you'll find a way. And that's why I keep going back to the political will issue. You know, and you can look at examples around the world, and one of the problems is you can look at examples around the world and pick the one you want. Yeah, well, that one actually fits the outcome I want, so why don't we look at that one? And then somebody else will come in and go, yeah, but that doesn't fit the outcome we want, so why don't we go for that one? But again, you still get back to that political will issue.
Yes, please. And if you come to the microphone, it will be just easier. Would you please come to the microphone? Yes.
Hello, Ipek Harris here. Thank you all for these insightful talk on especially the internal dynamics of this issue. I left a little bit curious about how regional dynamics beyond Russia and Iran might be at play in here, given that the region is full of energy-hungry countries, Turkey in point. I was curious, where do you see Turkey situated in this chessboard? Like, is it a potentially cooperative friend, a potential big market, a potential investor, or is it an uncooperative rival? So this will be my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone?
Well, I can't talk about the energy picture, so I'll turn to these two for that. But I think, you know, you asked a great question because I think, you know, ultimately, the relationships between Erbil and Suleimania and Ankara and Baghdad are important here. And I think we all need to recognize that the way that Turkey addresses its own internal issues with the Kurdish people certainly influences how it chooses to engage both in Erbil and in Suleimania, where it has a very challenging relationship, as well as with Baghdad. And I think, you know, certainly while the KDP and the KRG leadership have a much stronger connection to Ankara, you know, I think that we have to recognize, you know, Turkey has no interest in seeing, you know, an independent Kurdish state due to its own issues internally with the Kurdish people. And so I think that that will always be kind of an issue that is the context of the relationship there. And I think we've also seen over the past several years, actually, a much better relationship between Ankara and Baghdad, and efforts by Soudani and Erdogan to try to develop a more cooperative partnership. And I don't think you've seen over the past few years, even though there have been certainly Turkish military efforts against the PKK, you know, this current Iraqi government has not really been very vocal in criticizing those. And I think that part of that is because there has been this effort to focus on economic ties, on energy ties, to try to see if there's ways to work together to address some of the water issues. And so ultimately, you know, if you see a stronger relationship between Baghdad and Ankara, I also don't think Ankara is going to take steps that really jeopardize, you know, that important partnership.
Yes, please, Lux.
Hi, I'm Lucas, a master's student here. Question for you, Noam. So Iraq is super hyper-focused on fossil fuels, extraction, all that stuff. Is there ever an interest to diversify the fuel mix, renewable energy, especially solar? A lot of desert there, a lot of sun. Is that a plan? Is that an opportunity for Iraq?
A very good question. So here's the thing. Yes, absolutely solar. They've been talking a lot about it. Even at COP28 in the UAE, if you listen to Iraq, you'd think like, wow, Iraq is just gonna be a leader in renewable energy. So here's the thing, they talk a lot, but again, when it comes to energy, it's not always about just generating it. You have regulatory frameworks they need to be working on. You need the policy, you need the right climate investment. All these things Iraq need to be working on. What they're doing right now, they're putting the cart in front of the horse, as always. So this is a big problem. Yes, they have a lot of potential when it comes to solar. Not only Iraq, even like take Saudi Arabia, for instance, right? Or the UAE, they're working right on it. Iraq is not working right on it at all. And they have a fascination with oil production. In Iraq, you hear more about oil production increase over like next few years. They want to keep increasing the capacity and less talk even about gas and renewables. So there is this fascination with oil production in Iraq. And I trace it back to decades ago. So this is why I believe also Iraqis themselves, specifically Baghdad, needs to innovate the way it looks at energy itself. So this is my take on it.
Just add that, because one other element, and we actually haven't mentioned it, and I probably should have put it in terms of risks, and that's infrastructure. And it goes to Noam's point, is you can have all the generating capacity you want in the world. If you don't have a functioning grid and you can't link it to a functioning grid, then you have a real problem. And infrastructure has been woeful going back to 2003. The development of infrastructure and the lag in infrastructure, and that goes for the oil and gas sector, that oil sector as well. There are some fantastic stories sort of in the early 2010s of storage capacity being built in the south and how long it took, and bits that were missing, simple bits that were missing, because the infrastructure wasn't followed up on. But I think in the energy sector, and particularly in the power sector, that is probably one of the biggest drawbacks. And when you talk to companies who are thinking about or have been approached in terms of investment in non-associated gas in Iraq, that's the first thing that they point to. Now, the KRG's made progress in terms of that. And I think, to Yerevan's point, there's something to be learned in terms of the tariffing. There's something to be learned in terms of the rationalization of the sector. But there's also a huge infrastructure question. And as yet, I've not seen any really good concrete moves by the electricity ministry to be able to deal with that.
And also, just to add to what Noam and Rad said, Iraq's electricity generation, 40% is lost in transmission. So the infrastructure, infrastructure is so horrible. Baker Institute put out a very, very good comprehensive report, I think about a week ago. It has all the details, and I didn't believe it until I really saw it. It's just incredible.
So remember what I mentioned at the beginning, the supply chain? This is it. The supply chain is not just generation. You have the distribution, you have the transmission. We need to think about all these things. If you're interested, just go to the EIA, the Energy Information Administration, US, right? And just take a look at it. They have a beautiful map. And just you will understand how complicated the supply chain is. If you listen to Iraqi officials, like just talking about, like Ra'ad understands, right? Excuse Victoria, but he's in the energy, so he understands like how ridiculous it is. And what's the point? Always asks, what's the point of bringing more power plants if what you're gonna be actually generating, half of it, you're gonna lose it. So it doesn't make any sense. So I just wanted to highlight supply chain. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, Siobhan, please.
So this is Siobhan, and I'm a student here. And you guys in your description blame Iraqi politicians for not advancing their system. However, I felt like you guys forget the true order comes from Iran, especially most of the politicians, they cannot do anything without getting approval from like many militias who are actually controlling the capital.
It's just not true.
I think it's true. There's many like,
You may think it's true, but that's not true.
well, I come from Baghdad. I know my people.
As do I.
Huh?
As do I.
As to like those militia, they are actually controlling the parliament and the whole ministers. And many times, like the Iraqi prime minister, they would like express their concern about their lives for not doing some things that may go against Iran.
I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that Iran doesn't have influence, nor am I saying that the
It's not
PMF,
influence. It's like a life threat influence.
that is influence. I'm not saying that Iran doesn't have influence, nor am I saying that Iran doesn't control and have influence over some really nasty players in Iraq. But the reality is that prior to the PMF, you still had all of these problems. The PMF, the influence that the PMF has asserted really since 2014, 2015. That's when the PMF came about. Those issues, the issues that have created problems in terms of reaching deals on energy, reaching deals on infrastructure, reaching deals on investment in the KRG and in Baghdad, those issues have been there since the beginning. So I'm not, so the notion that it's the Iran that stands in the way of this, that everything would be better if you just didn't have Iran, I think simplifies Iraqi politics way, way too much. And that isn't disagreeing with you. So what I'm saying is that it's an element, but don't just throw it on Iran. And I've heard way too many Iraqi politicians just throw up their hands and we can't do anything, which isn't true because they can do stuff when it's in their interest. And I've seen them do stuff when it's in their interest.
We have many like.
Okay, Siobhan, this is going on forever. So yeah, Miles, please. Probably that will be the last question because, 5 minutes, our time.
Good afternoon. I'm Miles Kaggins. I'm Director of Communications and Government Relations for the Association of the Petroleum Ministry of Kurdistan Region. And a quick invitation, then a question. In New York City between September 20th and 24th, for those of you who are interested in Kurdish culture, we're having the New York Kurdish Film Festival. I'm happy to share more details afterwards, or you can Google it, New York Kurdish Film Festival, our 9th edition. A question for our distinguished, or a comment for our distinguished panel. As I've been involved in, aware of the negotiations for resumption of oil exports through the Iraq-Turkey pipeline, and for the students here, we have seen the positive influence and coordination between the United States State Department and American oil companies, in particular HKN, but also with other international companies walking in step in concert. And as you mentioned, sir, sometimes there's benefits on all sides, but they're just not the political will to get things done. In this instance, though, I think that there is a new path forward for all investors in oil and gas, particularly for exporting external to the country between the Kurdistan region and federal Iraq, that needs to be publicized and standardized. So going into the future, it would be good to see the Iraqi parliament codify some of the activities happening now with current deals and put into the and implement it into the ministries where this is standard business practice. In the early days, how did you see those early companies that came in be successful? And do you have any additional comment about China, Russia, and France and other players in the region?
Really, 5 minutes? Miles, just actually before you sit down, just in terms of the early deals where? The early deals in the KRG or the early
deals in federal Iraq post 2003.
Okay. So going back to it, from a company perspective, as you look at
Can we
it,
be quick because the kebab is running out.
Yeah, no, sure. And I'm happy to talk to you on site. Look, from a company perspective, what the Iraqis, what GOI did was essentially simple. It had a really simple formula that Hussein Shahristani, to his credit, devised because he realized that if you had direct negotiations, you were going to have massive corruption. And Hussein could explain it very, very effectively. So it was, you have two metrics. What are you going to produce and how much are you going to charge us? And we'll work on that. I think, when you went to the KRG, there was obviously the issue of production sharing agreements, which, by Iraqi law at that particular time were considered to be, non-starters and something that the parliament didn't want. And I think when you also had the fact that they were being signed under terms that the Iraqi government wasn't party to, wasn't aware of, and probably wouldn't have signed up to. And I think, in terms of codifying those deals, and from an oil company perspective, it goes back to this monetization issue. It's exactly what I would say to any oil company advising them. How do you ensure sanctity of contract and monetization of the contract? And the problem you have with the Iraqi parliament is those deals fundamentally were at odds with how Iraq approached its own development of the sector in the south. So you're going to have to find some sort of balance between it. And this may not be the question you're asking, but it's the question I'm answering. And it comes to this. If I was sitting there as an oil company, what I would say is, look, I'm not going to expect Baghdad to take financial responsibility for contracts it not only didn't sign, but was purposely excluded from. Now, I understand the value of getting those exports out. So what we will say is, and it's codified under Iraqi law, it's there in the budget, that just as the sovereign spending of the federal budget covers the production costs in the south, I will do that for production costs in the north. You have an amendment to the budget, it goes up to $16 a barrel, whatever else, and then we can look at it. But the profit oil part of that was never something I signed up to. And it's not something I've offered companies in the South, and I know they'll come back the moment I do that. So I think what it then becomes is a negotiation between yourselves and the KRG to go, what can you afford? And tell us what you can afford. And if under those circumstances you can't afford what we want, we're going to have a renegotiation, or we're going to go to Baghdad and actually talk about what this is. But where I think the negotiations are running afoul at this moment in time, from a Baghdad perspective, is, fine, we accept the contracts, but we still didn't sign them. And now you're telling us that you want us to guarantee them. And we're saying we'll guarantee what we promised, the other companies, which is your cost of production. And then, the federal government covers whatever additional elements go in terms of the South, and the KRG has to do that. But I think where the companies in Kurdistan are being badly treated by the KRG is being sort of pushed front and center to go, get Baghdad to pay this because we can't afford it. And the company, and whereas as a company, I would be saying, no, you signed this with me. So if you want to renegotiate it, sit down and have an honest renegotiation. Don't shove me in the middle of this political dispute that is proving to be insoluble.
Thank you. If there's no comment, any more insights from, okay. So I guess we're just right on time. Thank you very much for your time, for your insights. Please join me. Thank you. And now you can leave the spirit of the Kurdish hospitality. Of course, the kebab, hopefully it has not been finished, but yeah, please. So,
We'd like to have so, wording about that, I guess. Like, it also precedents like this. And some of my
Oh, no, I
Sure.